GraphQL allows you to query your API to get exactly what you are looking for. No more, no less. GraphQL allows you to get the full power of the data from a single point of access. You can use it to create a unified API across your whole application. GraphQL allows you to use a type system to ensure that you only query what is possible. In this course, we will talk about the key concept of that you need to understand in order to get the best out of the GraphQL. Then we will learn how to configure the development environment. We will use GraphQL to query data with the help of the GraphQL mutations. At the end of the course, you will work with the relational data. You will learn how to query the relational data using the queries. And you will also get to know about the add, update and the delete relational data using the mutations. So welcome to a course in which we will learn how GraphQL in an ASP.NET Core Web API application. My name is Ankush Agnihotri. I am a full stack developer and I am a Web.NET developer and I am also a trainer. Now let's talk about a few things you will need to know for this course. In this course, we will integrate GraphQL into an existing ASP.NET Core Web API project. It is always a good idea to have a basic idea how a Web API project works, but it is not a requirement. I will be using C# as my programming language. As the framework, I will use the latest version of the .NET Core 8. And as the development tool, I will use Visual Studio 2022 Community Edition, but you will be use any of them like either the 2022 or the later ones. What is GraphQL? GraphQL is a query language for your APIs. But why we are using GraphQL when we have a REST APIs that has been available for decades? In traditional REST APIs, when you need to retrieve a particular type of data, you create a specific API endpoint or a specific type of DTO that will return you a specific response. So, for example, let's say you are building an app which is going to work with employees and department. If you want to get all the employees, in this case, you have to create a HTTP request and then have an endpoint around it. And same if you want to retrieve a detail of a single employee, in this case you have to create another endpoint and passing the ID and that will return you a employee detail. Now you can see the problem in this case is for each response you have to create a separate API endpoint. Now let's just say that you need to get only a employee title from the employee object. Now in this case, you either have to create a API endpoint or just create a new DTO and then use the mapper to get the data that you need. Or you can just return the whole employee and just use the title. But in this case, you are getting data from the server from the way more than you need it on the front end. That we called it as overfetching of the data. So basically, as you can see, you just getting the data from the server more than the need on the front end side, or it could be a other way around also when you need more data from the APIs, but API is not capable of returning all the data, or you have to do a lot of join to get the data, which in case the underfetching of the data. So basically you are getting less data than you need. So if we moving towards the GraphQL benefit, with GraphQL instead of having the multiple URL or the API's endpoint, you have a single entry point, or from this entry point you can just specify the data that you need it and you are going to get just that data. So basically there is no overfetching or underfetching of the data. Other than that, GraphQL you can easily aggregate data from the multiple sources or use a type system to describe your data. With a type system, you can easily describe a schema for your data. So then whenever you want to get the data, you can specify the exact data that you need. So before we start or writing any code, let's understand the GraphQL components. So we have the types, we have queries, we have the schema. First of all, it's important to know that the REST and the GraphQL are the two design API approaches that fulfill the same function. The data transmission over the internet protocol such as the HTTP. However, the way they work varies significantly. For example, GraphQL is a query language and REST is an architectural pattern. On GraphQL, you have a single endpoint and you basically customize the query based on the data you need as a response. On the other hand, you have the multiple endpoints, and we said that in complex application you have lots and lots of API endpoints. For example, you could have an API endpoint to get all the courses, you could have an endpoint to get all the books, and then you get the details to delete them and much more. The GraphQL is the client driven architecture, whereas the REST is a server driven architecture. A downside of GraphQL that GraphQL you don't have an automatic caching mechanism or the API versioning, whereas the REST uses the caching automatically, and it also supports the multiple API version. Whereas the GraphQL only supports the JSON, whereas REST supports the multiple data formats, and whereas REST exposes the various HTTP status endpoint to identify the error easily, whereas GraphQL don't expose any endpoint or HTTP status. Now we all know the main advantages that we have already mentioned is that the GraphQL, since you get just the data you need it, so you don't have to overfetching and downfetching of the data. This is the biggest advantage of GraphQL. So before we start building our GraphQL project, let's first have a look at some libraries that can be used in different programming language to integrate GraphQL with the programming language of your choice. So let's go to the website, that is the graphql.org/community/tools and libraries. Go over there. So over there you can see how many languages GraphQL supports, like the C#.NET, Ruby, PHP, Python. So all the famous programming language that we have, Java. So it is ported by the GraphQL. So if you just scroll down here, you can see, if we click on the C#.NET, so here you have some sample GitHub repository over there where you can see like the hot chocolate, GraphQL net, GraphQL entity, and the client too. So using these sample libraries, you can take a look how it is being used into our programming language of your choice and how you can take benefit of the GraphQL. So these are some sample repository open source which you can check it out before proceeding it. So before doing any integration, let's jump out on the code. So this is a normal employee management web API project which is built on, if we check their properties, .NET Core 8.0. And in this project we have simple employee controller which is exposing different type of endpoints for retrieving all the employees, get employee ID, adding employee, updating and deleting it. And if we are moving to its data model, so here we have one entity table in it, employee, which has basic properties like ID, first name, last name and the email. And then we have the repository in which we have defined our method related to the database for retrieving all the employees, getting employee ID, adding new employee, updating an existing employee and deleting an employee, right? And then we have the data context file in which we have defined our entity, DB context models over there. And lastly, the configuration that you have to be do in the app setting.json, you have to be define your SQL connection string. This is one. And secondly, in the program.cs file, you have to be define two things over here. First, let me zoom in for you. First thing is you have to be registered your employee repository so that you can access it throughout your various in the controller or other levels. You have to be tell your application you want to add it in a scoped manner. And secondly, you have to be tell like what kind of database you want to use. Here we are registering our entity database context, and we are telling them we want to use a SQL server, and here we are reading its connection string and the timeout and the other options. Okay, now next thing, like this is whole about this source project that we have. And also quickly check our database. This is a sample database for this tutorial, so we have only one table which is empty right now. If I execute it, no record into it. So let's quickly start our project. And also, if we see the configuration, we are using Swagger UI for the endpoint documentation. So you can see the Swagger, nice pretty endpoint documentation. With the help of Swagger, it provides us. So let's quickly try to add one employee here. So click on try it out, put the first name. Let me zoom in for you, and then the last name, and then your email ID. Okay, so ID you don't need to be pass it since it is an add operation. Click on execute, and you will see a response body. You will get a ID back from the database. Quickly check your database, it is executed successfully. Yeah, one record successfully added. Now quickly check the other endpoints. This is the add one. Now you want to try this out, execute. You will see a array. Right now we only have one employee, so you will see a array of all the employees that is available in the database. Moving towards the ID one, pass the ID. Since it has ID 1, we know it, so here you will retrieve the list of all the response by ID. And same way you can update it, the ID record, and delete the record, right? So this is the basic project overview in which we are going to be implement the GraphQL. And before doing anything, we will first try to install the dependencies that we need it for installing the GraphQL into our existing project. So the first step to integrate the GraphQL libraries into your existing .NET project is you have to be install the libraries. So go to the project dependency, right click on it, and go to manage NuGet packages. So over there you have to be first search for GraphQL, and this library you have to pick it. Be careful for choosing the version for that you are installing. We need a 4.6.1 version, so I am choosing 4.6.1. click on install, and it will take a couple of seconds to install it. Now the next library that you need to install is GraphQL GraphQL. That is basically a GraphQL interface that will act as a middleware for our ASP.NET Core application. The version that you need to install is 2.0.0. So click on install, click apply, accept. And now the next version that you have to look for is the library GraphQL.server.transport.system ASP.NET Core.system text.json, and the version that we are looking is 5.0.2 version. So select the version, click on install, click apply, and last package that we need to install is GraphQL.server.ui.graphql. That will provide us the playground, and the version that we are looking is the compatible version is 5.0.2. So click on install. This will install our all the required dependencies or the NuGet packages that we need for the GraphQL. Now go to the next step is go to the program.cs file. You need to register the GraphQL into your application. So the very first thing is builder.services.add GraphQL and add system.text.json so that it will be understanding the communication language between the GraphQL and the .NET Core endpoints. Now the next thing that you need to be registered is under where the app, after the app is built, you need to be tell GraphQL the endpoint for your playground. And the another thing you need to be add is your schema class. This we will add later on once we add that class. Now after installing GraphQL into our existing web API app, our next step is to see what are the different kind of operation in GraphQL. So in GraphQL, whenever you are building an API to handle data, you build the API endpoints and then send HTTP request to those API endpoints. You send an HTTP call to retrieve data, you send a HTTP delete request to delete data, and so on for other type of operations that we have. And we already seen our API Swagger visualization for our existing web API application. Now, in order to work with data in GraphQL, there are two main kind of operation. First, we have the query type. As the name suggests, a query type is used in GraphQL to query data from a data source. And we have a mutations also, and mutations is used to write data, or we can say write data to our data store. And we have one more other operation in GraphQL that we called as subscription. A subscription type is a type of operation that allows you to establish and manage a real-time connection to the GraphQL server. So the next thing we learn in this is types in GraphQL. So we have the basic types, we have the object types. So in the under the basic type in the GraphQL, you have the string, you have int, you have boolean, you have float, and then you have a ID. Now let's see how we are collaborating these in our .NET. So in GraphQL, where you have the string like this, in .NET we have a string like this. And then in the GraphQL for .NET library, we have a string graph type. And same way for the int, we have an int graph type. Same for the date time graph type. And similar for the boolean graph type ID. And then for the ID long and integer, we are treating it as ID graph type. Now, if we take a basic example for the object type in the GraphQL, you have any example object in which you have a two property ID that is of type int and the name that is of type string. Now, if we compare this with our .NET, so in GraphQL, you have an object like this, and in .NET, we define this object using this format like the int and the ID that is the standard one. And same if we see this object in the GraphQL.NET library, so you have to be create one class that is of example type, which is inheriting from the object graph type, and here you have to be pass an example or class type, what type of class it is that belongs to .NET, and then in the constructor of that particular class you have to be initiate the values. Now the next step is we have to be create a complex object type. Now so in our solution folder, create one folder named as GraphQL, because we will create all GraphQL related queries or create our classes underneath that folder. Now create one more folder underneath that, that is types, and underneath you have to be create one more class named as employee type. So if I open this class, so in this class what we are doing is we are created one class which is inherited from the object graph type, and here we are passing it the employee type because that is the our entity class that we have created that consisted of our .NET properties. So basically in this class, two things we have to be remember. One is the object graph type belongs to the namespace GraphQL.types, and secondly we pass the object type. So under is constructor we have to be define our fields that we have. So in the field section you define the field property and you are telling the GraphQL the type of that particular property is id graph type, because that is a int, and other three properties are the of string graph type. So and after that we are defining its description. So if you want to be add any new property, let's say if you want to add this, let's say what you have to do is you just need to be type a field and then bracket start and then make a lambda expression. Then you have to be define the type, what is the property that you want to be mentioned, and then its type you have to mention. Type of, basically first you have to be define the type colon type of, and then you have to be specify what type of the object is, which is the string graph type, and then ultimately its description that you want to be specify. In our case it is the last name property of the employee object. So just copy it from here, paste it here, and here it is last name. That's it. Let's say if you have any other property like the date type and whatever, so remember the last slide from ours, you have to just mention date here. So on whatever the types you have to be define it. Whatever the properties that you have in your employee entity class, you have to be define those fields over here, so that GraphQL understand, yeah, these are the fields that they have to query. So after you created a employee type, the next thing you have to be create a query. So create one new folder over here named as queries, and underneath that folder you have to be create one class named as employee query. So employee query. Now this class need to be inherited from object graph type, and in this constructor of this class you have to be create your query or define your query for the GraphQL. So what we have to do is you have to be create one field, and that is of list graph type, and that list graph type basically returns us all the employee type query. So employee type, and this employee type, what it is returning us, it is returning us all the employees, and these employees, that is the object name. Now the next thing is you will define the description over here, return all the employees, right? And lastly, the most important thing that in this field section is the resolve function. So in the resolve, what you have to be do is you will create one context, and in this context you have to be pass your repository. So for doing that, what you have to do, we already have this repository, employee repository. You have to be inject this repository into the constructor of this class, and here is your repository, and now you will call this function that you need to be passed here. So repository dot get all employees, so we will call here. So this is our very first query in the GraphQL. So let's try to understand again. What we are doing in this query is in the employee query class, which is inherited from the object graph type that belongs to GraphQL.type namespace. And in this, the constructor of this class, you are telling like you have one field which is returning your list type graph type, and that is of further employee type that we defined our class. If you go to the definition of this, in this you have defined your fields. Now further it will be called it as employee object, and here you pass the description, return all the object, and finally the most important thing is the resolve function, where you have passing the context and you are passing the repository that will return you all the employees. So after we write a query to retrieve all the employees, now we have to write a query to retrieve a single employee by passing a ID to it. So how to write? First type the field. Now you have to be pass the type of it instead of the list type. Now it is a simple employee type. So pass the employee type over here, and now the next thing you have to be do a name of it. Add a semicolon at the end, press enter. Now pass the object that you want to be returned. Now it is a single employee, so just name it as employee, and now give it a description over here, a little description. So it will return a single employee by passing a ID. Okay. Now the next important thing is the you have to be pass a parameter over here. So in this case it is a new, which is a query argument. So query argument, add a namespace for this. So it is where we are misspelling, so arguments, yeah. So we have added a e over here. So now query arguments. Now you have to be pass a new argument over here, which is of query argument, and which is basically a not nullable graph type, and that is of int graph type. Basically it is a ID that we are expecting to pass over here. So now after that you have to be define a name of the object that you are expecting. In our case it is ID that we are passing. So let's zoom out so we will have a single view. So ID you are passing, and then you will pass a also pass a description or the default value. So what we want to be pass description over here. So basically description is the employee ID that we are expecting over here. Now after that what you have to be pass is you have to be pass a resolver function for it. So resolve. Now in this case what you have to do is create a context and make a lambda expression over here. You have to be call a repository dot get employee by ID. Now over here you have to be retrieve a context dot get argument, and argument that you are expecting is the ID, pass it, and now simply it is a int dot main value. Now close the brackets. Now this query is completed. Just move the below bracket on the last line so that it is in the single line. So let's try to understand what we have written is for retrieving a single employee from your query. You will first define the employee object and then added a description. Now you are passing a query arguments. You can pass a multiple arguments also, but in this case we want to be pass a single argument, that is a ID, which is of not null graph type and it is of integer graph type. Now you pass the name of the query object that you want to be passed and a little description for it. In our case it is an employee ID, and now in the resolve function you will create the context and then passing calling a function to resolve that object or function to so that it will retrieve us the exact object that we were expecting from this query. Now the next step is to create a app schema. So let's create that. Under the GraphQL folder you have to be create one class. Let's name it as app schema. So this app schema class basically need to be inherited from schema, and that schema belongs to GraphQL.type. And under this schema, what we have to be do is you have to be create a constructor of this class, and in this you have to be pass your employee query. And this query is basically is to tell GraphQL this is the query that you want to be passed. Now that's it. Now the next thing is you have to be go to program.cs file, and you have one line commented that is your app class schema over here, right? So underneath you have to be pass your app schema class and semicolon. Now all you have to be do is go to this URL. So copy this. Now run your project. Now what you have to do is go there UI/GraphQL. So now you can see your GraphQL playground is open. Now what you have to be do is you have to be clear this and start typing your GraphQL query. Now under this curly braces you have to be first try to call your employees query. So employees, and for this employees what you are expecting is you are expecting ID, and then email, and then, and let's see a first name also, first name, and then the last name. Just format this. Okay, and now you have to hit the play button. You will see you have an exception over there which says unable to resolve the dependency for the app schema. Now go to your program.cs file over here. If you go to the app schema, and here you can see in the constructor you are passing a employee query. So you have to be tell your application like you want to be register the service for it. So go underneath that. So tell your builder you are expecting this service. So adding a scope for it, and that's it. And also adding a scope for app schema. App schema. That's it. Now run your project again and go to the swag UI.GraphQL, and now try to write your query again. Now you can see the intelligence is coming automatically, and now you can see your object is also over there. So first name and the last name, and you can see a little description on the bottom, last name property of the employee object. So click over there, click play. Now you can see the magic comes over there. You will have the data of it. Now the best thing or the powerful thing of the GraphQL is now if you want to be retrieve only the ID and the email, so just pass in the query. Now you will see in the employee you are only able to retrieve only those data that you need, is not overfetching or not the underfetching, right? So you don't need to be create any endpoint. You just need to tell your query I need these parameters and you are good to go. Now let's test our second query, that is retrieving a employee. So let's get rid of this, and now employee, and under for the employee what you have to be pass ID, and that ID, let's say let's pass the ID 1 because we only have that ID into our database. And now for this what you want to be you want to retrieve ID, and then you want to be retrieve email too, and you are good to go. So now run. Now you can see you are only able to retrieve a single record from it. So this is the beauty of the GraphQL. You only need to be pass the query and you will get the dynamic data based upon that. Like you want to be pass this, boom, no overfetching, no underfetching. As I told you earlier, this is the best benefit of the GraphQL. Now, next is what is mutation? Mutation is used in any operation that involves manipulating data. So, to add a data, you need a mutation. To update data, you need mutation. To remove data, you also need a mutation. So, basically, mutation are used to modify the data in a data source and return a value. In our case, the data source is the SQL Server database. So if we compare query versus mutation, a query in comparison to the REST API is like the GET request, and the mutation are like the state changing methods, which for example are the post, delete and put, etc. Now switch to the Visual Studio to add our first mutation. So under the GraphQL folder, we have to add new folder named as mutations. So mutations. Under this folder, we have to add a new class. Let's name it as employee mutation. Mutation. Now this class will be inheriting from object graph type. Object graph type, let's call it namespace, that belongs to GraphQL.types. Now add a constructor of it, the shortcut for it CTOR, you can use it. Now inject our employee repository instance in it. Repository. Now first thing in this we have to define a field. Now in this field we have to define a type, that is employee type, and now same we have to first give it a name. Oh sorry, formatting issue. So first give it a name, we are calling it as add employee, comma, you can see IntelliSense came up. So first thing is the name, and then we can add a description also to it. So description field is used to add a new employee to the database. Now next thing is the arguments that we have to pass. So arguments, new query argument, that query argument basically arguments, and now we have to define a new query argument here. So new query argument, that is basically non-null graph type. And now we have to define its type basically. So for querying we have our own type, so let's define a new type that is named as employee input type. So where we have to define it, so under the types, this employee type is used to query. Now add a new type over here, let's name it as employee input type. So this input type basically need to be inherited from input object graph type. Now in this employee input type, what we have to do is first create its constructor. In this constructor, let's name it as, and you will name it any name you want to give. I am giving it as employee input type. And now we have to define its field. So your field first is of string graph type. So these fields are those fields that you want to pass basically. So if we go to our database file or model, you can say, so we want to create these three fields. So all are of string type. So let's name it as this. Create a 3 copy of these. So last name and the email. So let's assume you have other types you can define here, like the int type and the data type, any type you can define it over here. Okay, so since our employee input type is ready now, so we can call it as here. Now what we have to do is we have to give it a name. So let's name it as employee, and now add a semicolon here. Oops, I think I am passing a wrong object over here. Yeah. So after this, what we have to do is, after you define the input type, you can give it a name to it. So here you can see we can define its name, metadata, description, and the default value of this query type argument. Okay. So let's name it as employee and add some description to it. If you want to give some default value, you can define it here. So description should be employee input parameter. Okay. Now the next thing that we have to do is we have to define our resolve method. So context, in the context, and he is asking for parentheses. So in the context, what we have to do is, first we have to retrieve our employee object from the query arguments. So let's retrieve it. Context dot get argument, and that argument is of type employee that we have to pass, right? Employee, and its name is employee over here, right? So after we retrieve the query argument, next step is to call the database parameter. So return, you have to call repository dot add employee and pass the employee to it, right? So this is our first mutation. So now we are seeing it is throwing a warning like employee may be null over here. So simply what we have to do, if employee not equal to null here, and then we will call this, and then if it is null, then simply pass a null response over here. Just a type of handling that you want to do based upon your business needs. Now the next step is to test this mutation. So to test this, firstly we have to go to the program.cs file, and we have to define our mutation same way like we did our query over here in the program.cs file. So builder dot services dot add scope. So in this scope you have to pass the employee mutation. So employee mutation, and now the next step is go to the app schema file. Over there, same way the way you are passing the query, now we have to pass a mutation also. So employee mutation, name it as mutation, and tell our GraphQL this is the mutation for our application. Mutation. Now click save. Now hit F5 to run this project. And in the meantime project is building, we will quickly go to the database to check how many records we have. So execute this. Right now we have only one employee. So let's go back. Project is building now. It is in the running state. Now go to the GraphQL URL ui.graphql. So over there, let's try to add our mutation. Okay, so how it is being defined? Mutation, curly braces. Now the moment you start typing, you will get the IntelliSense. So employee, add employee is used to add a new employee to the database. That is the description that is being defined. So in it, the first employee object, that is the input type. Now in this, you have to define your fields. That is the first name. Let's call it as Amit. And then last name Hotri, and let's enter it so that it is all in the one view. And now the last thing is the email. So amit.agnihotri@gmail.com, right? And now what we have to do is curly braces, you define the values. After that, you have to define your values. This is email. Sorry, first is your first name, and then the last name, and finally the email. Okay. Now hit this play button, which is basically used to execute a query. So the moment you execute the query, you will see a new employee is added over here. And if you go to the database now and execute the again, you will see a new record is added over here. Now if you want to be retrieve the ID also, so the thing is you have to be define ID over here. And now just change the parameter to Rahul and change it over here. And now play the press button again. You will see you are getting the ID also from the database data source, which is in our case is the SQL Server. Now let's execute again to verify record is inserted. So you can see now we have 3 record. So this is how we can add a new record using the mutation in the GraphQL in the .NET Core. Now the next step is to add a mutation for update our employee. So how we can do it? Just create a copy of it. Okay, now we will call it as update employee. It is used to update a existing employee to the database. Now in this argument should be employee input, plus we have one more input argument over here, which is of ID graph type, that is basically the employee ID. So new query argument, and this argument again is of non-nullable graph type, and that type should be your ID graph type. And that ID graph type, basically its name is as ID, and let's give it a description to this argument, and this is the ID of the employee that need to be updated. Fine. Add a comma over here. Now we have, in this case, we have the 2 query arguments. One is the ID and second one is the employee input type. Fine. Now in this, the resolve thing, employee input type argument, we are already fetching it. One thing we have to fetch it more, that is your ID. So same way, in this case its name should be id, and now instead of the add employee you have to call the update employee. But in the update employee, what we have to pass first the id and then the employee object, right? And this is of int type. So that's it. That is how we can write a mutation for update a employee. Now to test this mutation, let's hit F5 and let's try to update our records that we have into the database. Let's take an example. We will update this third record. So go over there, go to the GraphQL UI. Now instead of this mutation, now what we have to call is update employee. So in the update employee, the first parameter is your id that you want to update. In our case, the id is 3 that we are looking to update it. Let's update Rahul to Sunny and also update its email sunny.agnihotri, and we want to retrieve this column after we update it, right? So let's click this play button and you will see for the third id your record is updated. And let's switch to the database to cross verify it. Click the execute button. You will see the third record is updated now. Now the next step is to delete a course. We have to write a mutation. So just create a copy of it and paste over here. Instead of update employee, now we define it for delete employee. It is used to delete an existing employee to the database. Now in this case we have to be passed only one query parameter, that is your id of the employee, and we retrieve it from the context. And now in this case we have to be call your delete employee method, and which is expecting a id from you, and at last you can return true response from it, right? So let's quickly test this delete employee mutation also. Click on play button. Okay, we have parentheses error. So over here we have extra comma, so let's remove it. Click on play button now. Go to the GraphQL playground. So over here what you have to do is you have to be write a mutation. Let's first query the existing employees. So for that, let's type your query, and what we want to retrieve is id and your email, and that's it. Click the play button. Now you can see you have 3 record into your database. Now let's try to delete the last record that we have. So let's write a mutation syntax for it. So mutation, and now what we call it as delete employee, and in this we have to be pass id. So your id is 3, and after that try to retrieve its id again. So that's it. Let's click the play button. You can see since we are not responding any response to it, so let's go to the database again. Right now we have 3. Click on execute. You can see the last record is deleted. And if we go back and try to query the record again, you can see only 2 records are fetching right now because the third one we deleted using the delete mutation. Now, after we successfully write our delete query mutation, now the next step is when we are working with the real world application, we have to be query the relational database also, or you can say the relational data that is linked to each other. So for this, I have created one example for you. So simply what I am doing is, with the employee, I am attaching reviews. So what I meant to say is, with each employees we have a multiple reviews associated with it. For that, I have created one table that has a column ID, rate, comment, and the employee ID as a foreign key relationship. So for those 2 employees that we have into our database right now, I have inserted a dummy comments for them. 2 belongs to the employee ID 1 and third comment belongs to the employee ID 2. Now this is the database change. Now moving towards our code changes, what we have to do in the data folder, you have to be create one class named as review. So in the review class, we have 3 properties: ID, rate and comment, and employee ID that is a foreign key for the employee table. So we define our foreign key relationship like that in the review table. And the next change that we have to do is, in the employee class, we have to be add a list of reviews because each employee consists multiple reviews. So it's one-to-many relationship. Now the next step is open your DB context file, and over there you have to be add a review entity. This is the database related changes. Now if we go to our repository, we have to be include, when we are retrieving all the employees, you have to be include the reviews associated with that employee. We want to be fetch that also, and same goes when we are retrieving get employee by ID, you have to be fetch the reviews also. So we are including those reviews into our response. So these are the backend changes. Now moving towards our GraphQL changes. So the very first change that we have to do, close this data folder, open the GraphQL folder. Now what we have to do is, we have to define firstly a class that is named as review type. So basically we have to define a type for our class. So click on add class. So basically you can also do it, create a copy of this employee type and paste it. So what we have to do is, we have to rename it to review type and then press enter, copy this name and update this class name and the constructor also. And now it is of, instead of employee, it is of review type, right? And now in this review type, as you know, we have 3 properties: ID, in the review we have a rating, comments and the employee ID, right? So employee ID is a foreign key relationship, we don't need to define it over here. So we already have an ID that belongs to review object. Second property will be your rating, and as we know, rating is of int type, so change this, and description should be rate property for review object. And lastly, you need a comment that is of string type, so comment property for review object. That's it. So in this way we can create our new type that belongs to the review type. Click on save, close this. Now the next change we have to do is, open your query schema, employee query, and also your employee type. Before going to the query, we have to go here and define our new relationship, that is one-to-many reviews relationship. Now in this you have to create a field similar like this, but the difference is now it is a reviews, and which is of type of list graph type. So list graph type, that is further is type of review type. So mention that, and this is your list of reviews for the employee object, right? So in this way we can define our relationship over here. Now the next step is, let's run our project and open the GraphQL playground and try to fetch the reviews now from there. So it will take a second to run. Okay, now open the GraphQL playground. Over there, now since we are fetching the employees, so click run. It will be working as expected. They are returning ID or email. Now what we have to be retrieve more in this is the, if I beautify this query, now the next thing I want to retrieve is reviews. So in the reviews, what I want is rate and the comment property from it. So prettify, let's run, and now you can see your get query is retrieving your ID name plus an array of reviews object. And same for the next employee, we have a comment for this. So in this way we can retrieve a relational data in the GraphQL. Now the next step is to add that relational data using the query. So the first change that we have to do is we have to define the input type for the review type. So similar way, create a copy of this employee input class and paste it over here, rename it, give it a name. Let's name it as review input type, copy the name, go inside of it, update the name, update the constructor name, and also this name. Now what we have to be defined, we know we have two fields inside of it. One is the rate type and another is the comment. So we know comment is the string type, but the rate type is the integer type. So int graph type. So this is the first change, we have to create the rate input class. Now the next change we have to do is go to the employee input class. Over there we have to define a field. So create a copy of this. Now add a field that is of list graph type, which is further a review input type. So list graph type, which is further a type of review input type, and this is your reviews. Fine. So here adding reviews for employee object. Fine. And over there, let's first save this query into your notepad file and paste it over here. Now let's try to write a mutation over here. So under the mutation, what we want to do, we want to add an employee, and in the employee object what we want to add is, we want to first add an employee object over there and passing the properties of it. Now what are those properties? First name, let's pass it as Rahul as a first name, and last name will be Agni 3, and then email ID associated to the employee, @gmail.com. And now the last one, that is reviews. So since reviews is of type array, so square brackets, and then on that square brackets we have to be pass objects, that is first the rate. Let's pass the rating, and then after you pass the rating you have to be pass a comment. And this is our, in our database right now we have 3 comments, so this is comment 4, right? So after you pass this, now the next thing we have to be defined is your respected columns that we want to be retrieve it after we pass it. So in this bracket what we have to be define is add a curly brace over there and retrieve ID and then email, first name, last name, and then the reviews. So in the reviews what you want to retrieve, you have to be define it. So we want to be retrieve ID, rate, and comment. So prettify it by click on it. So whole the query will go over there, whatever you are passing. And now let's click on this play button. And now you can see a new employee with added with the required information that we input over here, and the comment is added. Now go to the database to quickly verify that previously we have 2 employees, and now you can see a new employee will be added over here. And same goes for the reviews. Previously we have 3 comments or reviews. Now you can see we have the 4 reviews on the table. Now, if you reach so far, that means congratulations, you have successfully completed the course. So in this course, what you have learned so far, you have successfully introduced with the GraphQL, and you will also able to query the data in the GraphQL as we did for the employees list and the employee field. And we did the data mutation, in which we perform the add data, update data, and delete the existing data. And we also work with the relational data using the query and the mutate. And now what to do next? So next you can do update relational data with the GraphQL, you can practice it, and also delete the relational data with the GraphQL. And if you face any query, you can contact me on these email IDs which is mentioned. And also you can subscribe my channel Core Knowledge Sharing, where I have uploaded the other .NET Technologies courses also, and also uploaded the Angular courses over there for the beginner full series. Thanks for watching.